Hello, welcome to Time to Say Goodbye. It is the 19th of June, Juneteenth when you hear this. Tyler, happy Juneteenth.
Thank you, Jay.
We are, we've got it's just the two of us this week, and we have a kind of a rundown type of show like PTI. We're just experimenting with different formats because it's the summer and we think that, maybe something will work, especially now that we have this video component to it. We don't really know how to do the video component yet. We're still futzing around with it a little bit. And we don't want it to impinge too much on the audio, which is obviously like what the vast majority of you who've been listening to the show for a long time have gotten used to. But I don't know, a quick bam, bam, bam type of topics thing doesn't ever hurt. And it might be a good way to start this show. But before we get into that, you sent me these videos this week because it's something that you've been interested in. And let's watch the first one together right now. Okay, I don't think we need to make that go on. For those who are listening, it is a video of a hobby horse competitor, and they show her the hobby horse. Tyler, what's hobby horsing?
So hobby horsing is a sport. We're going to use the word sport. That was, I think, founded in a Nordic country, and it's basically like, show horsing or dressage, but without the, physical biological horse, replaced with a stick with a homemade horse head crudely attached to it. I think they make these themselves. And they sort of do all the things that show horses would do. It's apparently it's a co-ed sport. It seems like mainly younger women that do it, but they sort of prance around and jump and do all the typical horse activities. I was interested in it because I'm always interested in sort of weird sports. And this just went like extraordinarily viral on Twitter. I think it got 40 million views as people sort of debated, whether this was ridiculous or not. Someone subsequently shared another video that's actually very impressive. Like some of the jumps and stuff these people do are like legit. Like I couldn't do them, I guess is how I would put it, in a million years. But yeah, I mean,
The
it's
video
just,
is of I don't know, it looks like about a maybe 16 to 20-year-old girl jumping over a hurdle that's like appears to be 5 feet tall. I mean,
that's ridiculous.
holy shit, she is flying up there.
While
Wait,
holding
so
this horse.
yeah. It's like, so one thing I didn't know until you just told me is that, so part of it is that they make their own horse heads. Like there's
Yeah,
not a
apparently
standard
most
thing.
of them like make their own like horse stuffed animal horse head on a stick, is my understanding. Like,
Okay,
I'm
and
sure you can buy one.
is that part of the judging? Is like the
That I
way
don't
in
know. That's
which
a
you
really good
create?
question. I'm not sure.
There's this part about this, which is, I think, just like dressage, I imagine that they are um judged on the precision of their steps, right? And
Yeah.
how like you have to do perfect form every single time. That shit's hard, man. It's kind of like ballet where you have to really keep your entire body rigid and in
Yeah.
a very specific way. Um, that's
Or
hard.
walk
That's some hard
racing.
shit
Yeah.
to do. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
walk racing is a little different because that's just a form of walking. Like this is like I imagine that certain muscle groups are
Yeah.
extremely developed and other ones are not, but I don't know. What
Well,
was
what do
the
you think,
debate
man?
about this thing?
Part of it was, I mean, a lot of it was just people roasting this girl, and then part of it was also is this a sport or not? Right? Like subsequently, another tweet about this that went super viral. Someone said, "Not defending hobby horse girls, but you have to admit this is absurd." And it's that video of her
Yeah.
jumping over this huge thing. So I don't know. As you know, I think I tend to be pretty. Like my impulse, I guess it's a mean impulse, is to like make fun of this, but
Yeah,
there's
but
a lot of sports that are weird, man. I do a
you put
weird
on a
sport.
wetsuit and go swim out to random ass rocks to catch fish. Like
Totally,
how
100%.
could
So,
you possibly judge these people?
no,
The
that's what I'm
thing
saying.
at least they're not gonna die doing their stupid thing. Whereas every time you tell me about wetsuiting, I'm just like, that's like the dumbest thing
Uh,
I've ever heard of. It seems so needlessly dangerous.
I mean, I'm
Just
sure
sit on a
hobby horsing
boat.
comes with its risks, but what do you
Yeah,
think, man? Is it a sport?
My impulse is to disagree with this Colin Rugg guy who shared it because I hate him. He seems to
Yeah,
be
fuck
like
that
the
guy.
Philip Lewis of the right, where he just kind of shares viral clips, and then there's like a tinge of politics, and like what the person's politics are, but they don't explicitly say something. They're just
Yeah.
kind of like this hub of viral shit. This is a sport. I don't know. Why wouldn't it be? It seems like it's physically demanding, and probably I bet the people who are good at it have to be good athletes.
Yeah.
My standard for this is also sometimes based on whether or not only rich people do it.
Sure. That's
And
good.
hobby horsing seems to, I bet these people are at least middle class,
For sure. What,
but
you don't think there are a lot of poor people running around hobby horsing?
I don't think that this has a very high price of admission. For
Yeah,
example,
yeah,
like actual dressage,
yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah.
or actual having to have a horse.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so,
It's
for that
also
reason, I'm
vegan.
inclined to support it just because it seems kind of healthy. If they like it, who cares, right? And it's better than like sailing, you know?
It's way better than sailing.
Yeah.
I'd
Well, how
also
does
would rather watch this than sailing. I'd rather watch this than golf also, I would add. But
yeah,
yeah.
honestly. I like watching golf, so I won't go that far. But the sailing part of it, I remember when I showed up at Bowdoin, there's some kids on the sailing team, and I was so baffled by it. It's not like I grew up in like some place. I'm not saying I grew up in like Alabama or something. I'm
No,
like,
sure,
what's a
sure.
sailboat? Like I knew what a
Yeah.
sailboat was. But I just didn't understand that. I didn't know that we had a competitive sailing team, and
A
that,
team.
some
Yeah.
students would go to college to sail. Like that seems ridiculous. It seems much more less of a sport than this. What is sailing? You just pull on some fucking
Dude,
ropes.
the most like angry hate mail I've ever gotten for anything I've written was for a single sentence in a thing I wrote about for the New York Times about college admissions, where I made a quip about them letting in rich kids for being good at rowing a boat. I got so much hate mail for that rowing a boat line from people who do sailing. Like, I cannot tell you, I got way less hate mail from like the white supremacists when I wrote about Richard Hanania than I did about like that single line about sailing. Sailors
But
go
rowing a boat
hard.
is crew, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Crew.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Crew's
I mean,
another
I
one.
guess there's no rowing.
Yeah,
I'm
I'm
similarly
also
disdainful.
skeptical of crew as a sport. Like I get it, and I
Sure.
understand why. I'm sure it's hard, and I bet that most big crew guys could beat me up fine.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
But like it does seem like it's what slightly unathletic, uncoordinated rich kids at prep school do. All right. You wanted to ask me about. Okay, so we are now entering the rundown part of the show.
Yeah.
If this was PTI and I was actually good at video editing, I would put like a rundown screen right here on the left
Nice.
hand side of the screen. So I might be able to do that soon, but just imagine it for right now. And so the first
I'm
thing that would be
visualizing it.
flashing would be parenting.
Yeah. So, I mean, I really liked your piece on tiger parenting. I mean, the reason I really liked it was that this was something I thought a lot about. When I was a tutor in Queens, I worked with a lot of Asian American folks and families where their tiger parenting would be an apt description. And there was at the time a lot of discourse about it that was like mainly pretty negative. And I was kind of like, I mean, these kids are really talented. They have hobbies and interests, and like, I mean, I appreciate that drilling piano many hours a day is perhaps not has its like downsides or whatever. But I don't know. Like, I found it. I always found there to be something admirable about it, and it did produce kids who seemed to have interests and talents and so on. And it never, I was always confused as to sort of, it seemed to get a bit of a bad rap. And anyway, I thought the article you recently wrote about it in your newsletter was really, thoughtful. You have a great quote that really resonated with me in particular. The most unhappy adults I meet were told from young ages to pursue their dreams. Some of them can express their ambitions in grand language, but lack the basic ability to meet deadlines. They seem to lack the understanding that all work is dignified as long as you respect it. And I think that's just I really agree with that, and I think it does seem to me that the like adults I know who feel the most happy and well-rounded, had some sort of parental encouragement around pursuing some of these activities, even if at times it was onerous. I think I always had a kind of deal with my parents, which is that as long as I worked hard and my grades were good, I could sort of take time off to pursue my fishing tournaments and doing whatever hobbies or whatever. And that's very different than drilling piano or violin or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. I think discipline is like good, and the ability to embrace drudgery a bit is like not a bad thing. I don't know. But is this you mentioned you make your daughter do writing lessons, right? Or not lessons, but like write every day, right?
Drills.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'd do that growing up, and so I thought it was useful in my career to, because so much of writing is just sitting there and having to actually pound something out.
Hmm.
And I think that part of, and then also not being in a state of great agitation and distress while doing so.
Yeah.
And so, my sense of writing was always that, uh, or has evolved a bit, right? Once you're past the idea or the illusion that it comes out of some spring or fount in your soul that just happens to be pure and more poetic than other people's.
Mine comes from my soul fount, Jay.
Right. You just realize, oh, I'm just kind of typing, and I have to. The reason why people who are also talented at writing, or who also have figured out that they want to write and have read a lot of books and are able to sort of replicate some of what they've read in books, fail at being writers is because the act of writing, when it's painful to them or when they have to do it, is actually too painful and they start to really dread it. That's my sense of it, at least. And
Yeah.
so, how do you, there is no question that sometimes writing can be frustrating and difficult. And so, how do you stop yourself from feeling that pain?
Hmm.
Well, as a child, you kind of have to have that pain part of it drilled out of you. You have to just get used to it. And so I think that that's probably true of everything, everything that is true of. Like, you just have to learn to deal with boredom and um, dissatisfaction and frustration. And that's probably like the only actually good lesson that parents can teach their children, at least in my
Yeah,
opinion.
yeah, yeah.
Because, as my daughter grows up, or as I think more about, I see other kids, like a lot of the stuff is very hardwired. You just start to realize that these kids are kind of on this weird autopilot in a lot of ways that you can't control. You can make things easier for them. You can provide for them so that they don't get overtaken by like material problems, right? And that's
Hmm.
what one should try and do. And that's why, society should make that as easy as possible for parents, or as like universal for parents as it could. That's where a lot of my general left politics come out of, which is just like, I don't actually believe that outside of material questions that parenting does all that much.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
the one thing that you can do is you can kind of make them stop whining about everything,
Yeah.
like
Totally.
that's basically where I'm at with parenting. And I don't know. I know a lot of kids because I know a lot of Asian people. I know a lot of people who, like, Amy, if a white person saw how they were raised, they would be aghast in the same way they were aghast at Amy Chua's book, right? They
Yeah.
would be like, oh, that's bad. And I don't know many, if any, who really think that, who are scarred by that upbringing. I don't know
Interesting. Yeah.
many who are like, "Oh, I wish that I was like grew up like the white kids." I don't know any people who think that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I
Yeah.
think that people generally appreciate whatever work ethic got drilled into their heads. If you send your kid to endless sports practice and like sign them up for competitive baseball or whatever, you're doing an even worse form of tiger parenting in my mind, because like
Totally.
there's a chance that the kid is going to grow up and learn math and like it's going to be applicable in their life, right?
Or
They're
they
not
might
going to
play
make the
piano. Yeah.
fucking major leagues.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
what are you like, what's the best that's going to happen? They're going to play on their high school team, maybe play like at Bowdoin or something like that, right? They get a little bit easier way to get into college. It's fine,
Yeah.
but um the idea that they're going to play professionally and that you've invested all this time and money into this one thing, and yet you're shitting on parents for caring about the academic side of it, that's the part that just annoys me. I'm just like, no, you're kind of doing the same thing. And what's interesting now is that a lot of Asian parents in suburbs are kind of doing the intense sports thing too. Like we're
Mm,
doing it too. Me and my wife, my daughter loves playing soccer, so we, this is why it's so familiar to me. So I'm not judging those parents either because
sure.
I do it too. I'm just saying it's all kind of tiger parenting in the end,
And I
right?
think our society has like a profound allergy to boredom, which is obviously downstream from all our technical apparatus. But I don't know. I think like the ability to like apply yourself to some drudgery is not a bad thing. And I think I mean, this is one of the things that I thought was really smart about your essay was the point that like tiger parenting's actually become pretty naturalized across the like sort of cultural spectrum in America. And you're right about the sports thing. I mean, a thing I think, as somebody who's in higher ed and sees student athletes, a thing I think about a lot is, the first few times I encountered, graduating senior student athletes who were really distraught about being done with the sport. I was like, I mean, I thought it was kind of ridiculous, And then I thought about it and I was like, these kids have been drilled their whole life. Their whole life has revolved around this sport. So they could, end up playing D3 or D2 or whatever it is, XYZ lacrosse. They've known nothing else. This isn't a hobby they can take with them. Like once they're done, And
Right.
there is like that to me feels, and not that people shouldn't do sports, but like devoting that kind of intensity to it. To believe 99.99% of people who do these sports just adrift, and it's not something they can take with them for the rest of their lives. And I'm sure they get some kind of like discipline or whatever out of it, and work ethic and so on. But I don't know. I think you're right that there is kind of a little racism baked into sneering your nose at like tiger parenting applied to academics or like musical instruments, and then pretending that like the same thing with sports, which is like an activity that doesn't even necessarily leave these kids with anything in the long run, is yeah, I don't know, it's definitely
Yeah, it's
questionable.
also like all those things are getting more and more expensive the more competitive you get, right? And every sport, basically every youth sport that can get you into college now has a price of admissions that escalates every single year.
Yep.
It becomes more corporatized and privatized. And at some point, you have to realize that it's probably cheaper just to send your kid to Russian math or to tutoring or to Kumon than it is to send your kid to these other things. So then, what are we really talking about at this point? It's just that there's two separate tracks. One of them is intense academic track, and the other one is intensive sports track, right? Or drama or whatever, like extracurricular track. And they're kind of the same thing at this, and that in a lot of places, like the places that I wrote about, like Irvine, California, where there's a ton of
Hmm.
Asian people and also wealthy white people, or Scarsdale, New York, parts of Westchester, New York, or the northern Chicago suburbs, right? There's a lot of Asian people there. Uh, you're having this kind of hybridized, assimilated culture come out where a lot of the Asian kids are playing sports, a lot of the white kids are doing the other thing, and that we have this culture now where because college admissions is so competitive that all this stuff is getting accelerated, and that I think is bad.
Yep.
Like I just think that there should be a form of this type of strict disciplinary parenting that is separated from that, from
Yep.
college admissions and competition's fine, but like college admissions and the idea that if you don't get into these schools after doing all of this shit, then you failed, right? Like
Yep.
that's a part that's toxic. And my sense of that is that that is not really the parents' fault, and that's not really the
Yep.
community's fault. That's the fault of the fucking colleges and for the higher
100%.
education system in America for making it such a scarce resource on purpose and then fucking bragging about it. All
I mean, I
right.
think you're right to disentangle, in particular, the like college competitiveness problem from the like instilling work and competition, and like those are two different things and they feed each other. But I think like there's a bit of throwing the baby out with the bathwater when people want to like just criticize any sort of push to have your kids involved in extracurriculars and other activities, etc. Like that, those things have are good unto themselves, disentangled from just a tool to get into Yale or whatever.
You have a kid now, right?
Yeah.
And so do you think about any of this stuff? Because your kid is very young, so obviously it's not something that you're dealing with directly right now, but you will in like, let's say like 6 months or maybe 9 months, right? Like what do you have have you like set up a set of uh parenting philosophies or anything like that?
I think a lot about how, like, I had a lot of hobbies, and I still have a lot of hobbies, and I think that is like a gift my parents gave me. I think they were always really encouraging of rabbit holes I wanted to chase down, and as long as as long as I was doing what I needed to do in school and everywhere else, they're pretty supportive. And I think that's the thing I think about a lot. Like, how do you, and because I have friends that don't have a lot of hobbies or interests, and their life is just like drinking at brunch and, hanging out. And like, if they have kids, they do stuff with kids, but they don't have like a sort of autonomous sort of, a set of things they do, that brings them joy, that is not just like scrolling on Twitter or whatever. Not that I don't do that too, but yeah, I don't know. So I think about that a lot. Like, how do you encourage, interests in children from a young age? And I hope my son likes to go fishing, so I'm definitely like, I have a game plan for that, because you got to introduce them,
What's the
since
game
they're,
plan?
well, I mean, you got to start with like low intensity, hot, like, stimulating fishing. Like, fishing for small, like bluegill and panfish and stuff is extremely easy, and you're almost always guaranteed to catch something. And so I've read a lot about this. Like, you want to start with like, because I mean, fishing's a lot of drudgery, man. Like, I spend hours of my life alone, not catching anything, getting hit in the face with waves. It is very boring, But like, kids don't want to fucking do that, So you gotta,
No,
like, if you
nor
want
should
them,
they. They should
no,
definitely not
totally.
get in
So if
the
you want them to
ocean.
do something, yeah, you gotta,
Yeah.
like, start slowly, or guitar or whatever music. He bangs, like, he like holds like spoons and stuff and like bangs on them, and he loves music, and he seems like he would like drums, and you can get them drum sets pretty early. But I played drums when I was in high school, and it was so loud, and my parents, like, I was constantly waking my parents up with my drum set, and like, I don't know, I'm really worried that like, I would regret that. So, but yeah, I've definitely thought a lot about, like, how do you encourage interests? How do you do so from a young age, and how do you make it
Is
fun
there like
without?
a Earl Woods of fishing? Is there like a great fishing guy who was basically trained, in a laboratory to be a great fisherman by his overbearing tiger parent?
No, that's a really good question. There's definitely, I mean, kind of the answer is no. Particularly the sort of fishing idea I do. Historically, you could sell striped bass, and you could make a lot of money doing that in like the '60s and '70s, like a lot of money. And so there a culture developed of just like not talking about it at all. Like, if even if you ask somebody like, "Hey, did you catch any fish?" They're like, "Oh, fuck you." I'm not going to tell you anything, because this is how
Right.
I make my money. Why would I help? And a lot of that sentiment still prevails, and so it's just really, I mean, you just have to figure things out on your
What
own.
about
There's
like in like the bass fishing world,
Oh
right? Where it's
yeah,
just
so I grew up
televised and
doing
stuff.
freshwater bass fishing tournaments, and there's like really good club infrastructure. Like, so there are these like local bass fishing clubs where you do little local tournaments, and then those sort of nest up like Russian dolls into sort of bigger and bigger tournament circuits. And there's a really good youth mentoring for that kind of fishing. There's college fishing teams. There's actually a lot of infrastructure for that. That's really good.
Okay, but are you gonna try and be the Earl Woods of fishing then? You're gonna
No,
No,
no.
no, that kind of sounds like you have a plan here. All right. Second thing, I want to, our friend friend of the show, Max Reed, who has been on, I think 5 or 6 times on our show, wrote an article recently, and I thought it was kind of interesting. And it ends with this really interesting question that I want to ask you. The title of the newsletter, and you should read it at his Read Max newsletter. We'll put a link to it on the show notes. Is Dimension Apple, right? And what he's talking about that is that, like, if you think about all the Apple marketing that we've seen over the past however many years, right, about the iPhone specifically and some of the Apple products, and if we watch the Apple keynote addresses, which obviously are big, big deals that everybody talks about, less so now, but like in the days of Gizmodo or whatever, right, like sort of intense
Yeah,
tech
yeah.
blogging, these are huge events that Apple, because it is a communication device, when it is marketing itself, it needs to somewhat simulate conversations between people, right? And that these people are obviously not real people, right? This is how marketing kind of thinks of itself, and they make up a person who is having a conversation with another person. And I don't know, this is why I think Max is such a great writer, because it's an interesting thought where you're like, oh yeah,
Totally.
they've
Yeah.
kind of created this entire world, right? Or a dimension of people, and who are those people? And he sort of points out that they like to go hiking a lot, right? Which is true. Right?
That's great.
Every photo is of a hike, right? They plan elaborate parties that they talk about all the time, which is true, right? Like there's always like kind of like, oh, on January 24th, so and so's birthday party with a lot of exclamation points. And he says, in general, while the this is from his piece, while the familiar, uncannily polite texting style prevails throughout the WWDC materials, this is the latest keynote, which is about iOS 18. There is a notable loosening of orthographic standards, the most important change, which I am putting in bold to really emphasize its novelty. For the first time in the history of Dimension Apple, its occupants have stopped putting periods at the end of their text, right? And so, like, obviously, this is it's a funny piece that he's writing. He's not writing it in any type of very serious way, but he's basically pointing out that like this world has its own rules that they used to put out, right? That they used to put that there, if you do pay attention to this stuff, that there clearly is some sort of rubric for how Dimension Apple gets laid out there. And I don't know. I think that the question that I wanted to ask you, which was that you seem to agree that this dimension does exist and that you're familiar with it, right? What influence do you think that has on the way that we communicate, right? Like obviously you think about like Neil Postman's book or something like that, right?
Mhm.
The idea that the medium is the message, or which he borrows from Marshall McLuhan. Then it would make sense that we kind of, after years of being inundated with Dimension Apple, using products that are basically have Dimension Apple in mind, that
Yeah.
perhaps we would start parroting Dimension Apple in some sort of way. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I mean, this is something I'm sort of passively very interested in. I think a lot about it in terms of actually Twitter, because I was not on Twitter for a very long time, and only got on Twitter I think a year ago, and just the like constraints of the format definitely have to change how people think about writing, and like I think in general, like these, whether it's our cell phones, how we text, email, even stuff like Slack, they definitely create idiosyncrasies in language use, and that sort of produce a kind of image of writing and communication, or sort of produce our communication in their image, I think, in a certain kind of way, and I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, a thing I've been thinking about a lot, particularly with Apple. One of the things he addresses obliquely in this recent newsletter too, right, is the coming integration of ChatGPT and Apple via what they're calling
Right.
Apple Intelligence, which is just entirely fucking dystopian. But no one's asking for this, but we're all going to do it. I'm sure we're going to use it like that, and that seems to be how Apple in particular works. Is that they conjure up some image of what human communication is supposed to look like and what human use of technology is supposed to look like. No one's really asking for it,
Yeah, like
and
the ports, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. No one's
Right.
asking for it, and you just like adjust. And I think there's this sense we have that technology addresses a human need, and that the need predates the technology in some way, and that the technology fills the pre-existing vacuum. And with Apple, and a lot of these, particularly, the push for large language models and AI, like no one's really asking for this outside of a very narrow subset of use cases and industries. And it seems like with Silicon Valley, we've gotten to a point where like there's not a pre-existing need that is then being filled by tech, but rather there's like tech creates this image of a use case that we're all funneled into, and yeah, I don't know, but I thought it was a really smart piece, and I liked the just like taking seriously these like fake conversations and personas in this like world that Apple has conjured up, but yeah, I thought it was very smart.
Yeah, it's actually, if you think about it, quite a profound question, because the AI part of it is very real, right? Now, for these, and you have to ask, who is it for? Now, I have noticed while editing this podcast, or even the program that we use called Zencaster, which right now is crapping out. Um, and they've just attached all these quote AI tools to every single one of these programs, right?
Yep.
If you're a video editor and you open Adobe Premiere, or Final Cut, which are the two programs that a lot of people use, then you'll just see this endless list of new AI features, right? And almost all of them are useless if you're an old school editor.
Mhm.
I think that within a generation from now, that maybe some of them will be used. But it's not like these things have no influence on us at all. I mean, I remember when texting started, the idea, or when emojis showed up, I just didn't use them for 2 or 3 years, and I thought I would never use emojis
Dude,
because
me
that's
too,
just not who I am.
100%.
And now I just use them, you know?
Yep.
It's like, and they're not always just used ironically. Or the little tap back button on iMessage. I fucking hated that shit when it started because I was like, you don't have to respond, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
fine. I'm just typing to myself basically. Like, I don't really care if you respond or not. You don't have to give me a thumbs up. And now I use that shit all the time.
Totally.
The heart thing, like I
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
pound that shit. And it's like, uh, and so I imagine that some of these AI tools, called AI tools, are going to be used in that type of way, right? But it is interesting in the way that it has shaped our conversations, that we just do what Apple tells us to do. And it's a little bit
100%.
distressing. And more so than Max, I do think that I just because I live in the Bay Area, like I am around the people who actually kind of inhabit this uh dimension
Dimension Apple.
Apple. They do go hiking all the time. All they talk about is fucking outdoor gear, right? And outdoor stuff, right? They talk about
Mm.
Tahoe endlessly. And
That sounds awful.
well, I don't know. I'm trying to be careful because, I know a lot of these people
Sure.
and I have similar conversations. So I don't want to say that I'm like that they're somehow separate from me,
Sure,
but
yeah.
it's a thing, it's
Yeah.
like they kind of exist in this consumerist mind place where things are scheduled around socializing in a way that I find to be have always found to be quite oppressive. So when I first
Mhm.
moved to San Francisco, I met a lot of these people, right? And they would throw these huge parties and they would go hiking, or they'd be like, "We're all going to go to the beach and do a bonfire and pick up tartine, which is some famous bakery on the
I love
way." And
Dartine.
yeah,
Their
I'm just like,
cookbooks are amazing. Yeah.
like, can you guys just chill the fuck out? That's always my thought. But they exist, right? And now all those people are fabulously wealthy. Like some of them are really wealthy,
Yeah.
and I think they kind of do the same thing, but they all have kids now and everything like that. And so there's this replication of it. And um the AI part of it, I don't know. I think that we're in this test phase and that most of these tools aren't going to be used and a lot of them are not going to go away. But I will just say that like we use this thing called Descript for this podcast and it makes editing the podcast super easy. It pumps
Mhm.
out a transcript and the video tool, you just highlight the part of the text that you want and then it immediately boots it over a clip thing. The captions are already there. You can just type you can just choose the look of the captions that you want and then you export it. It takes 2 minutes, whereas before do that whole process would have taken a much 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 longer period of time, and so
Yeah, yeah.
um the proliferation of these clips, right, which we are also doing, and it has changed the podcasting industry quite a bit because now everybody is doing short video clips to fit into that type of thing. And
Yeah.
because these tools have made it easier, then everybody's going to be doing it, and then you have like a flood of stuff that comes out. And then the discursive point of the podcast is changed in ways that is interesting. You would think that it would only go very short form, but in fact, the opposite has happened because people can just watch it through clips. People's podcasts are like 4 hours long,
Yeah, yeah.
because like the sort of, I don't know how not to get too like literary about it, but kind of like the foundational text,
Yeah.
right? Almost doesn't matter, right? It just needs to be able to generate the clips.
Yeah, yeah.
And so you might as well just talk forever and hope that you stumble upon some sort of viral
S
moment or something
Something
like
good
that.
comes out.
Yeah, that's just what we're doing right now. All right. All right, flashing. The topic is changing right now. You wanted to talk about the Surgeon General Vivek Murthy's call for a warning on social media. This is he
Yeah,
wrote
so
about it in an op-ed. Yeah, tell me what his argument is.
yeah, so he argues in a New York Times op-ed that social media companies should social media platforms should come with a warning for parents. I think for people under 18 that they might not be safe. And the thing that I think is the reason I thought it was like a really productive intervention into the debates around social media use in children. I mean, there was that height book, about cell phones, whether they're rotting kids' brains and stuff like that, and people are like, oh well, they were quibbling with the data and whatever. And I don't know if that book rests on sound evidentiary foundations or not. I sort of don't care. And so far as my opinion is that like these are obviously bad for people because
Right.
we know that because they're making us crazy. So I kind of don't care what the sort of social science says. But
Right.
anyway, what I thought was really productive about the Surgeon General's intervention into this sort of ongoing debate is that he kind of, points out that the onus should be on tech companies here, right? Like the onus should not be on us consumers, independent researchers, academics to prove that these platforms are unsafe. It should be on tech companies to prove that they're safe, right? Like that should be on them. And I think that's like a really productive reframing of this debate because a thing I get personally very frustrated by is just this evidence question where people are always like, well, what is your evidence that smartphones are bad for kids? Or what is your evidence that Twitter or social media or Facebook or whatever and we'll often point out that the studies aren't so great or that they point in different directions. And I think it's very obvious to anyone who has used any of these platforms that they're not so good. And so I think shifting that evidentiary burden to the companies themselves is good. But I'm going to read this passage. He says, one of the most important lessons I learned in medical school was that in an emergency, you don't have the luxury to wait for perfect information. You assess the available facts, you use your best judgment, and you act quickly. The mental health crisis among young people is an emergency, and social media has emerged as an important contributor. Adolescents who spend more than 3 hours a day on social media face double the risk of anxiety and depression symptoms, and the average daily use in this age group as of the summer of 2023 was 4.8 hours. Additionally,
Oh
nearly
boy.
half of adolescents say social media makes them feel worse about their bodies. It is time to require Surgeon General's warning label on social media platforms stating that social media is associated with significant mental health harms for adolescents. The Surgeon General's warning label, which requires congressional action, would regularly remind parents and adolescents that social media has not been proven safe. So I guess I kind of just wanted to ask, your take on this, Jay. I mean, I know you are I think you and I are both pretty skeptical and exhausted with the sort of social media stuff and cell phones and everything else. But there's, I mean, there is like a not directly, but I mean, these are platforms in which people engage in speech, and including young people, right? And so I don't know, like, what do you think about this? Is this like a net positive? Is this a net negative? What is the view from sort of
Well,
Free Speech Island and so on?
4.8 hours is a lot, right? For teenagers to be adolescents to be spending on social media. Um, and I think that's the beginning and end of the conversation for me.
Hmm.
I don't believe that much in, I mean, this is something that I think that people who read the column will start to get to know because I'm going to write more about it. I don't really believe in things like anxiety or depression. I believe that people feel these things and that mental health is important, but I think that the ways in which we classify them are just kind of arbitrary in some way. And that the studies to try and figure out whether anxiety is on the rise. And it's like, what is, like, how do you study that? Now, one of the things that does seem true is that, teen suicide is up, right? That's actually a thing that one can track, right? Without sort of being in the muck of survey data or whatever, right? Like that's something that is up. And I think so. If you sort of disentangle all of this, you just say, I don't think it's really healthy for kids to be staring at these things for 5 hours a day. In our generation, they would watch television instead. It's true. They would be
Hmm.
just staring at a bigger screen filled with probably dumber material. But I do think that television was not as destructive in terms of the immediate social lives of these children as social media has been, right? Where
Yep.
these, it's no longer like, oh, I'm getting I saw Cindy Crawford on television, I have a negative body image now. I think that happened, right? It
Sure.
definitely happened. It was something that people talked about a long time. I think the body positivity movement in general has been quite helpful in a lot of ways. I support it, but that's different than like, I spend 5 hours a day chatting with my friends and all sorts of bad social stuff happens and I forget the actual physical world exists, right? And
Hmm.
that's what the difference is, I think. Television also, when we were growing up, was always seen as a negative, right? It was sort of frowned upon. It was something that, we did so shamefully, even though we did it all the time. I think that social media and phones have gotten that way at this point. So I'm not sure if a Surgeon General warning would do much than underline the idea that we probably should stigmatize this a little bit, right? We
Yep.
should think of it as a negative. We should treat it as like a treat that kids can do 30 minutes of if they do some of their other stuff. We shouldn't do it as like, oh, they're connecting with the world. And to be fair, I don't know that many parents who think that way, right? Like, I don't know. I do know parents who sort of have no limits on screen time or whatever, but those parents are generally just busy and, they're doing what parents in our generation did when they just sat us in front of the television for many, many, many hours, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why they're doing it. Um, I will say about the hate book, man, that thing is crazy.
Hmm.
I think it's kind of like a Dr. Spock type moment right now. I think it's going to have a huge influence on the way that parents think about their kids' screen time. I think a lot of parents are going to not let their kids have their phones because of that. Because, like, just anecdotally, I will say, just having talked to a lot of different people across a lot of different industries in my various jobs, everyone asks me about that book,
Yeah.
right? Even other parents that I meet here in Berkeley, they talk about it. Everyone has read it. It's
Hmm.
been the number one bestseller for many weeks. But I mean, I think that outside of that, like, I think that because it is so specific about how you should raise your kids,
Hmm.
that it's going to have a huge influence on it. And I thought about it a bit because, like, I'm not really that big of a fan of Haid's earlier work,
Yep.
in terms of like
Same.
whatever, right? Like college, like he wrote a
Can't
lot
leave
about
America
college
behind.
kids freaking out and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't really care. I think it's a net positive and that we should just kind of let this one go.
Yeah.
We don't have to quibble too much about it or whatever. We can just say it's really good that parents are going to try and get phones out of schools. Like,
Yep.
if that's all that happens, then I think that, like, it's okay to have this be kind of propaganda-ish, because I
Yeah.
think that phones in school is just a disaster, right?
100%.
We did not, we grew up watching a lot of TV, but we didn't fucking break out a TV in class and put it on our desk, right? And tell our teacher to go fuck himself if he said, well, can you just not stop watching TV?
Yeah.
That's what's
Yeah. Yeah.
happening in every single classroom that has not banned phones.
Yep.
And the teacher's job basically is now 60% to police the phones, right?
Yep.
That's intolerable from a labor perspective. It's intolerable from like a pedagogy standpoint. It's intolerable from just a human basic respect
Totally.
standpoint. And so if John Haid's book gets parents to get rid of phones in schools, I don't even care what's in the book. Like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just think it's
Yeah.
a net positive. So yeah, that's my general thinking about it. As for whether the Surgeon General should do a warning, if it sends a message to these companies that they need to actually
Get
be a
their
little
shit
bit
together.
more careful, then I also would support that. But I don't know. I'm somewhat skeptical. We've hauled these fucking tech leaders in front of Congress so many times and they haven't changed anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Next thing. This is something that you are I've kind of ignored this debate, but I think it's interesting enough that we should do it, because I've only ignored it not because it's not important. I've just ignored it because, like, I don't think I don't know. I just, like, I don't have an answer for it. There
Yep.
have been videos recently, many, many more videos, where Joe Biden seems to freeze. I don't know how else to put it. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it is distressing to see,
Yep.
right? And in this era where there's so many fake videos, it's hard to know whether or not they're real at first. But some of these appear to be very real.
Yep.
There was a one recently where he was on stage with Obama, and Obama kind of like has to gently grab his hand and pull him away because Biden appears to have frozen again. Um, what do you think? What do you think about this? Is the larger context of the debate is this larger? There is a debate. I think Matt Iglesias, Nate Silver argue back and forth about it. Whether do people actually care about Biden's age or not? Nate Silver his age is a huge problem. Matt Iglesias is like, no, it's just the inflation part of it, right? What do you think?
Oh, I think it's a huge problem. The age thing specifically. I think The first thing I would say is I think that's unfair, and I am all for ageism in politics. Like I don't think past a certain age you should be able to hold office, particularly like wield the nuclear briefcase. But the reason I say it's unfair is because I think like Trump shows obvious signs of cognitive impairment as well. But people don't seem to see that in the same way just because like Trump is vigorous despite his brain being like mush, and so I
Right,
think there's
right.
like a certain kind of vitality to Trump's dementia that is like lacking from Biden's own. And I think that like is to Biden's disadvantage. So, I mean, that's what I mean when I say it's unfair. I think they're both ill equipped, too old, clearly showing signs of impairment, but Biden's just aesthetically looks worse.
Yeah, for sure.
And, I think the reason I was interested in this is so, first of all, I do think, I mean, this is just anecdotally, but I know plenty of people who are more conservative or who are centristy kind of Democrats. And, I live up in Maine and I like the age thing, including among Democrats. Like I hear about that from like sort of working class Democrats way more than I hear about inflation. I mean, no one's happy about inflation, but I think a lot of people have a sense that the economy isn't some magic, like the thing a president can wave a magic wand and just put right. But I think the age thing's a liability. But the reason this conversation interests me is that it seems so hard to get like objective isn't quite the right word, but let's say objective perspective on this problem. Because on the one hand, so Mother Jones just ran a piece saying that like all these videos that are circulating of Biden looking dazed are selectively edited, blah blah blah, it's conservative propaganda. And that's like not wrong. Like the New York Post ran one in which Biden kind of like wanders off and it looks like he just
Oh yeah, yeah,
disappears.
yeah, yeah. I saw that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and they're like, but if you see the full clip, he was talking to somebody, but it was still the full clip's still weird because they're in the middle of some event and he just like wanders off to talk to some random guy. So on the one hand, you have liberal outlets that are being like, these videos are selectively edited to make Biden look bad, blah blah blah. And that I believe that's true. But then on the other hand, there aren't like those same outlets seem to want to deny that there's much of an age problem. I mean, you have stories here and there, but like it just feels like it's really impossible to just get a straight discussion of like, what do these videos mean? How are we supposed to interpret them? Because yes, are they selectively edited? Sure. Does he appear to be freezing in place bizarrely, repeatedly in multiple different venues, times, and places? Yeah. And so like, what do we do about that? And it doesn't seem like anyone wants to have a conversation that isn't either pretending like there's a certain kind of Democrat and a certain kind of like media person that wants like acts as though you're some right-wing conspirator for like noticing that he looks strange. And then there's like another side, which is like these propaganda outlets that are very blatantly trying to push a narrative that doesn't quite map onto reality. And it's really hard to get, for me at least, it's hard to get your footing, right? Because it's like, well, I keep seeing these videos. What information are we supposed to trust? I don't. I mean, we're in an era where it feels really hard to trust video, and yet at the same time, I mean, what we've seen from Biden, I find concerning. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think about all
Yeah.
this?
I mean, it is interesting to see how the conversation flipped from when Mitch McConnell was freezing himself, right?
Yeah.
And now Mitch McConnell is, kind of recused himself from a lot of stuff. And it's different than the Dianne Feinstein conversation, which I think a lot of progressives and leftists were much more willing to say that she's completely gone, right?
Yep.
And Dianne Feinstein was completely, she was not functioning in a way that a U.S. senator should, for sure. So it wasn't that people were wrong. I don't quite see the same like rabid defense of Biden's age that I think that you've seen. But what I have seen is a kind of, we just have to deal with it.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Like we understand he's really old. We wish he was 20 years younger, but he's not. And so this is what we're dealing with, and we just have to accept it, which is crazy to think because if Biden was 20 years younger, he'd still be 63. He'd still be like of retirement age, right? So I think that it's I think in this debate, I definitely side with Nate Silver in that I think it is a concern.
Mhm.
But I don't think that anyone is going to vote for Trump because they think Biden is too old and Trump
No,
is young enough, But it does make sense that if a man cannot run a vigorous campaign in any type of way and remind people why they should vote for him and not just vote against Trump, and that person seems to be quite impaired, and that if you don't really love the prospect of President Kamala Harris, then you might just be unmotivated enough to say, yeah, I'll vote, and then maybe you won't actually go vote when the day comes because you don't feel particularly inspired, right?
totally.
Given that the voting margins are quite small, will that have some sort of effect? Sure, because every little thing that could possibly have an effect is important. Um, I don't know, though, how the Democrats counter this narrative of him being too old, and that seems to be the real problem.
Yeah.
Are you going to put him out on stage and have him give a bunch of like vital speeches? I don't think he's
Up for
capable
that.
of that. I really don't,
No. No, no, no.
Do I think he's going to fail at this debate? No, I think he'll be fine because I think that what's shown is that, for the past couple of years, when the moment is really big, like it was during the State of the
State of
Union
the Union.
address, that he
Yep.
can kind of deliver that. But it's these random moments where he's on camera where he does seem quite old, right? Like he did seem to really freeze on a couple of occasions. But I don't know. Is that something that happens to people who are like going through the early stages of dementia? Do they just freeze? Like, is
You
that
know,
actually something? Because like that, I also thought that during the Mitch McConnell stuff, I was like, is this even something that happens? I just thought they got confused and stuff. I didn't think that they like basically shut off, like they were in.
shut. That is what it looks like. Like he just
Yeah, it
shuts
looked like
down.
he was just turned off. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I mean, I think people have said a lot on Twitter. It's that like, oh, this looks like my relatives had have dementia. But off Twitter, I've also talked to people that are like, I have old parents, and this is kind of what it looks like, and we don't let them drive, let alone run the country, and
Right.
so
I don't think Biden should be driving. I agree.
no, man, I don't know. I just like I agree it's beside the point at this point. It is just kind of is what it is. I guess the thing I just find galling is that there's a certain kind of person, like sort of like MSNBC-ish Democrat that wants to say it's ageism to point any of this out, and I just find that so galling. Like past a certain age, I don't think you should be able to be president. I mean, you have to, run the country in moments of crisis, and you need to make snap decisions about, what happens if a flock of geese appears on radar and you're not, where as happened in America's past, and we're not sure if it's an incoming Soviet missile attack or just, a flock of geese. Like these are kind of decisions presidents have to make, and they're really, I don't know. I just don't think a guy older than 70 should be in this position. So, I mean, it's a sort of thing where I guess I feel like I'm just very frustrated by the entire thing, and it feels like an institutional failure more than a failure of any particular, like
Well,
I just it's galling that we're in this situation where we have these two very old men, and I just like resent being told that it's ageist to like notice that these old people should maybe not be making important decisions.
is there like do you think there's a moment that could happen that would, like, what do you think would have to happen for the Democrats to basically say, okay, this is too big of a problem now, right?
I
Like,
think you
because
would have
these
to like
freezing things is
sorry.
not, it's one thing, right? They can try and explain that away, and they can kind of pound the gavel, being like, "We don't have a choice," which
Yeah.
they're right about that. Um, but what do you think would have to happen in public for him to step down, or to basically have the questions be so loud that they can't ignore them?
I think it would have to be an event where everyone was watching, like a debate, I think. Because, I mean, we've seen really bad, like him just babbling and just like being totally incoherent. We've seen images of him freezing, like, but they're also fragmented because of our
Right, they're
media
so
landscape.
short.
They're
Yeah,
so
yeah.
short. They're coming from right wing sources
Like Colin
oftentimes.
Rugg, that.
Yeah, yeah, and so people are like, I mean, I don't know. He's spouting a bunch of babble, but whatever. I don't trust this source. So I think it would have to be at like a debate or something.
Yeah, I
Like
agree. I
a
think it would have to
moment.
be a debate. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
where it was
also
just like glaring.
remember, like the same thing happened to Fetterman when he was debating
Oh
Dr.
yeah,
Oz, right? And people are like, a lot of political commentators were like, it's over, and then he won,
Yeah.
so
God.
and the Fetterman stuff I think was quite bad in the moment.
Hmm.
He did seem like he wasn't quite functioning,
Hmm.
and he still won, right? And we
Yeah.
didn't know who Fetterman was back then, so we were still talking about the progressive Fetterman, right? Other than not the I got in a car crash and had a near death experience, and now my life has changed, and now apparently I'm like no longer the person that I ran as. Which to me, by the way, just as an aside, like then you should not be in Senate. You have this responsibility. Don't you have some responsibility? Like you are you're a representative of people.
Yeah.
You're not a representative of whatever fucking epiphany that you had in your brain while when you almost died.
Yeah.
Like we didn't
Totally.
the people of Pennsylvania elected you to carry out certain policies and to argue for a certain type of uh politics. They didn't they didn't say, "Oh, we think he's a great guy, and therefore anything he thinks, we're also gonna think now." Like, you're not the fucking dictator. Like, it's a representative democracy,
Dude,
right? Like,
also, who
I
gets meaner after they have a near-death
yeah,
experience? Like, you know what I
exactly.
mean? He's like, he
Exactly.
almost died. He's like, I regret that I was not more of an asshole before. So now I'm just
Yeah.
gonna triple down
Yeah.
on being a dick.
Exactly. And also it's like, but that part of it, I read an article about it. It made me so mad because I was just like, look, let's set aside everything that John Fetterman says, and let's just say, okay, from an objective, abstract level, he had a near-death experience. He completely changed his politics, and now those are his politics. Right? That's not what you ran on. That's not what the people elected you to do. You
Yeah,
should fucking quit at that point. You should resign, and then you can go be a commentator on fucking Newsmax or something
that'd be
like
the
that,
responsible thing
and
to
then
do.
you'll be fine. But of course, like that's not how it works, right? But I was just like, either that or just shut the fuck up and don't say that part about how it was a near-death experience that changed your life, and now you're going to be a totally different person than the people who spent all that time and money and effort electing you thought you were, right?
Yep.
No, it's fine. I just decided to change my mind, and therefore fuck all those people. Like, it's ridiculous. It's like it turned my stomach to hear that stuff from him. I Anyway, to get to the final point of it, I agree with you. The debates, if he like really, really, really is bad, don't think it'll be a Fetterman type of thing, I guess is
Hmm.
what I would say. I think
Yeah.
that that's a good rejoinder or like a good rebuttal to it.
Yeah.
But like if he freezes in the same way during the debate, um I don't think the Democrats can run somebody else at this point, but I do think that it'll become the only thing that people talk about. And that's pretty bad for Biden,
Yeah. I mean, the other thing with
because
Fetterman too is like he was younger. They could say like, well, he's recovering from he's like on the pathway to recovery,
right, right.
and there's like no pathway to fucking recovery. It's just a downhill from here.
Yeah, yeah,
So
that's true. Yeah, and it's like Biden's kind of like a old running back or an old quarterback.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But we
It's
don't
like
have there's no
Cam
Steve
Newton.
there's no Steve Young waiting in the wings here.
No.
It's Kamala. And that's
Yeah.
part of the problem. I think that if the I don't even like let's this is a complete hypothetical here, but let's say that he had chosen Pete to be
Hmm.
everybody knows how I feel about Pete Buttigieg. It's not positive, right? But I think Pete at least has some juice with a certain demographic,
Yeah.
or did,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And Pete is actually quite good at television. He's good at giving top speeches, and he's good at
He's good on
explaining
Fox
things
News. He
in a
goes on
way.
Fox News
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
sometimes, and
He's
it's like,
good at he's
yeah.
good at all these things, right? Um, Now, if there was a cohort of the Pete fans who were like just dying to get this guy to be the president, and they could make an argument as to why that was good, and that argument was very appealing to the people who love Pete Buttigieg, aka a lot of media people, and that this excitement was broadcast everywhere at all times, then I could see that being like okay, right?
Yeah,
Like
sure.
we have a backup quarterback that has some exciting things that are about them, but
A Jordan Love.
it's very hard to do that with Kamala because
Yeah.
she's been such a strange train wreck for the past 40 years.
Dude, I have never, I mean, I don't know about you. I've never encountered a real living, breathing person who like the most positive thought they have about Kamala is pity. Like I've encountered that where like, she just, he stuck her with like immigration and like blah blah blah, and she's just like, but I don't know, dude. It's I mean, I think there's going to be a very good biography or history of this written one day because it's been a baffling vice presidency.
That said, I would rather have Kamala be the president than Joe Biden.
Oh, dude, that's funny you said that. In the last couple of weeks, I've been thinking about this, and I
Yeah,
was
I
like,
would
you know
much rather
what?
have Kamala be the president because,
Yeah,
it's not. First of all, the age thing is one thing. Secondly, I do think it would be good for society in some ways to have a black woman as president, right? Even if it's
yeah,
somebody who people don't like as much as Kamala. Like, obviously, there are better choices for that. And maybe Kamala would be better, you know?
yep.
And then
I mean,
everything
her
else,
greatest
I
sin is she's
imagine
boring.
Kamala would
Yeah,
be exactly the same, as
yep.
Biden. So, I think it would be better.
I totally agree. I'm sure stats bros would yell at me and say this is incorrect, but I sort of feel like if Biden shit the bed and he gets wheeled off as the nominee and Kamala becomes the nominee, I sort of feel like she'd have a fighting chance.
Oh yeah, because it's a
I think,
it's an anti-Trump vote. It's not a.
and a
It's
lot of people will be like, she's just boring. Like like she doesn't do anything, but that's like preferable to Trump. That's preferable to Biden and his like just bizarre, approaching senility. I don't know. Like I think a lot of people, if Kamala was suddenly the nominee, including people like me who don't like Kamala, would kind of breathe a sigh of relief and be like, okay, we can deal with this for
Yeah,
4 years or
yeah.
whatever. You
Also,
know.
if if Biden, for example, the first year, if he wins the election and 6 months later he decides to step down,
Yep.
I would be totally fine with that.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
I'd be like,
Yep.
okay, we have President Harris, and um, like it's not gonna. There's gonna be some funny moments out of this, but it's basically just gonna be the same as the last 4 years, right? And
Yep.
I wouldn't want to be President Harris, but she clearly probably wants to be. And what are we really going to talk about in the end, right? Like in terms of what the huge differences between the two are going to be. Like it's going to be basically the same, and one of them doesn't carry around this scepter of basically looking like they're a little bit too old to be doing this anymore. So yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. That's where it is. Anything
Kamala
else?
2024. No.
Um, all right. Well, thank you for listening to the show. It's $5 a month if you'd like to help support us. We're going to be bringing more and more features on in the next few weeks here. And so some of them will incentivize you more to give $5 a month than before. I will say that when Tyler joined the show, I explained to him, I was like, look, we do have a somewhat robust, but, plateaued subscriber base. And the reason why it plateaued was because when we started, we had stuff for our subscribers, and then Tammy and I kind of were just like, I don't know, let's just make it all free. And so we didn't have any incentives for that. And so while the people who listen to the show has increased, since it turns out that people just don't give you money for no reason.
I don't know, man. As a Marxist, that sounds wrong, but
I
it
know.
seems
But
to be
I
the
was very
case.
idealistic about it. I was like, no, the people will still subscribe because they like the show, But apparently, that's not true. If you don't offer anything and everything is free, then people just end up taking it for free.
Uh,
Shocked to know
who would have
that.
thought?
Yeah. So, but if you could, it does help us keep the lights on here. It's at goodbye.substack.com or patreon.com/ttsg pod. If you'd like to email us, it is time to say goodbye pod@gmail.com. And I think one of these next 2 weeks will be taking off for July the 4th. But when we relaunch the show, we're going to have a very special guest on, and you'll hear all about it. We're going to basically do like a subscriber
Palooza.
palooza. Yeah, that's the right word. All right, Tyler, I'll talk to you next week.
Peace out, man.